Hello, everyone. Welcome to Life with God. Tonight we're in episode 10, Studying the Love of God. And our guests this evening are joining us from Tennessee. Their names are Nicole and Alan Parker. And I'm so excited that you have accepted my invitation. I really look forward to this discussion about the love of God in the family context. Thank you so much for joining us, Nicole and Alan.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're
Also,
looking forward to it.
also part of the discussion, we have Kendra, Studying the Love of God. They are new, so I'm excited to welcome you as part of the Life with God program and as part of this discussion. Welcome. And we have also Elijah and Ashley. Welcome back. Good to see you again. For the first few minutes of this discussion, we're going to spend some time getting to know our guests. And as usual, I will be timing the 5 minutes with this hourglass. So let's see what we can discover about Alan and Nicole. What type of art speaks to you most?
Music.
I love looking into 18th century and before art where you can kind of get lost in the picture.
I enjoy listening to music as my favorite art form, and being out in nature, which is its own form of art from God's hand.
Yeah, that's great. Being out in nature without the children is particularly more powerful.
Very different experience.
What is your favorite way to spend a rainy day?
Snuggled up with a good book and a cup of hot tea in a bean bag with a soft blanket, and then my kids and my husband some of the time.
Yeah, I love to read a good book. It's one of my favorite things to do. So if I can just open a book, either study it or read it more casually, that's a great thing to do on a rainy day, but also to have some fun with some board games with the kids.
What is your favorite fruit?
Mangoes, always, especially fresh from the tree.
It's hard to beat mangoes. I love blueberries too. So those are just awesome. You just look a little messier after both of those.
What is number one on your bucket list?
Raising my children to love God and to be in ministry.
I think we both have expressed a desire to go to Australia sometime. And for various reasons, we haven't made it there, but we would like to go to Australia and New Zealand.
I may have had an opportunity to go and had to stay home because my husband couldn't manage all the children alone at that time. They were pretty young. Now we have 4 teenagers. I still don't think we could quite leave them at home alone, though. But anyway, someday.
What calms you down the most when you are stressed?
Music.
Yeah, prayer. Just having some time, go by myself, talk to God, and then I can talk to other people much more rationally.
I listen to a good Andrew Peterson song. I love Is He Worthy? And so often when I'm really under pressure, I'll just go listen and be blown away by the majesty of God, and it just shrinks everything down to its right size. Or going out in nature. I like to go out and walk and pray looking at the sky. That really helps me.
What is an inspiring person other than each other and Jesus? And give me one reason why.
Well, there are so many. I think inspiring for me, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his commitment to do what he believed was right, his commitment to community, his depth of thinking in the cost of discipleship. There's just so much in Dietrich Bonhoeffer that I really appreciate.
I have so many too. One woman who really inspires me is Ellen White. I look at how hard it is sometimes to break into ministry as a woman, and I can't imagine what it was like back then when women were just completely restrained from doing anything, and yet she would just fearlessly speak out amid all these men who were leading out in everything.
When did you first realize that you were loved by God?
Well, I came from a secular home, And I'd been exposed to Christianity and even Adventism through a school that I'd attended, but my home was secular. And so at the age of 13, my life was falling apart. And I called up the only church I really knew, which was the Adventist church. And I asked for directions, got on my bicycle and cycled to the church that was about 8 miles away. And when I walked in, I just felt God's love. And when I read the book Steps to Christ, that's when it became real to me.
For me, it was when I was 16 and I read the first chapter of The Desire of Ages. And I got to the end of it where it talked about the ceaseless ages of eternity and Emmanuel, God with us, and just the beauty of the character of Jesus. And I got tears in my eyes and I thought, I didn't know God was like that. If that's really what he's like, maybe I could trust him with my life.
Who is your favorite Bible character and why?
Other than Jesus, probably Joseph. I love the courage that he had in the midst of craziness when everything in his life is screaming at him that God is not taking care of him, that God is not going to work it out. He chooses faith, he chooses cheerfulness, and even in prison, he says, hey, how are you guys doing? Why do you look so sad today? To the butler and baker.
For me, it's Paul, partly because he's an intellectual and I resonate with that. But it's also because he has such courage. You know, he's willing to be stoned. He's willing to be shipwrecked. He has such a passionate love for Jesus that he balances that intellectualism with this deep passion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate hearing a few things about you. I think it really helps everyone know a few things about, you know, who you are, where you're coming from, what is your experience. And it's really awesome to have a couple today. It's a first for us to have a husband and a wife, and especially the topic being family. I think it will be helpful to get both of your perspectives on this aspect. For those of us who are watching live, we welcome you to this conversation. As usual, you're welcome to comment in YouTube in the chat box. We also have the link posted on Facebook, and so we look forward to your comments there as well. We will make room for you in the conversation. I hope you already know that, and so please participate. Feel home here with us. Nicole and Alan Parker are both professors. Nicole is an author, a speaker, and an adjunct professor of religion, I believe, at Southern Adventist University. Alan is also professor in the School of Religion at Southern Adventist University. And so I really look forward to your expertise on the topic of God's love in the family context. I would like to start this discussion with just an illustration, and I'm going to ask for a little bit of help here from the discussion group, from the students. These are two magnets, two of my favorite places in the world. I couldn't pick one, so I had to use both of them. This is my favorite nature place, Grand Teton National Park, one of my favorites. And this is my favorite building in the world. It's Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Now, these are two magnets, part of my collection. And this is also a book. I guess I just picked the title that I like, The Territories of Human Reason. Not as relevant, but so I'm going to put these magnets on the book here. And I'm going to ask you a question. What can the magnets do right now? Can they do anything?
They can ever so slightly inch towards each other over thousands of years.
Elijah. Okay, that's awesome. So I need to sit here for 1,000 years to see any movement on their part.
Yeah.
Okay, why can't they do anything?
Because they don't have anything acting on them. They're motionless.
Okay, they're motionless. Let's imagine that I have a 4-year-old child here, which I don't, but let's imagine I have a chair next to me and I have a 4-year-old child, and I pick him up from the floor and I put him on the chair. What can the child do?
Run away.
Okay. He can run away. He can sit there. He can
Make lots of noise.
make lots of noise. What is the difference between the child and these objects? What allows one, what allows a child to do things that the magnets cannot do?
I would say that a child, even if it's minuscule, has a little bit more sense of reason than a magnet does.
Okay, so he reasons partly, and what else? What else is necessary for motion, if you want, for intentional motion?
Well, the child has a will. It can move,
Right.
make choices to move.
Mhm.
The magnets don't.
Great. So the magnets are objects. They do not have reason. They do not have will. If they had reason but no will, it still wouldn't help. Now, here's another illustration to kind of finish this opening of the discussion here. Imagine a 12 years old girl in a chair in a professor's home. I've talked about this a little bit in a previous episode, so I want to bring this back just to touch on the subject to open the discussion. And the professor is the class master. He's a trustworthy person, someone of authority who loves the students and whom the students love. In my case, because this is part of my story, right? He was particularly important because he taught my favorite subject. He taught literature and language, and I was good at that. And I was, I was one of his favorite students. I think you can say professors favor many students in different ways, but I felt favored by him. And yet when I was going to tutoring, he would oftentimes over many years, he would touch me. He would touch me in areas where he didn't have any business groping, right? He would touch my breast. He made eye contact with me, just probably just checking to see my reaction and reading me. I never looked at him. I could see because I was right next to him. He sat me next to him at the desk. And so he would often be able to reach out my notebook, and brush off. For a girl in that situation, does she feel more like an object or like a person with a will? What do you think?
Object, because she's not being asked permission to be touched.
Okay, great. She's not asked permission. Do you think she would have the will or the knowledge even to say no? Maybe today, I hope we can say today more than in my case, in my time. But how do you think the authority difference, the power difference played into how she perceived herself in relation to the person of authority? What happened to her will?
In that case, I can infer that she trusted the person, and so at the beginning she might have given in some capacity her will to learn, her will to be taught, her will to pay attention, but the other person infringed on that will and took that will upon themselves. So that her will to listen to authority was corrupted into another person's will to assert and dominate.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't want to wait any longer to get into the discussion. So I think I just wanted to give you an illustration because I did not really understand this idea of objectifying people. And it doesn't have to be just women, right? Boy children. I mean, men can also be objectified. Human beings who are treated as if they do not have a will or should not have a will, or their will is not taken into consideration or even developed. In the case of my professor, part of his responsibility was to develop my will in a healthy way, and instead of doing that, he was diminishing it, right? And that had unhealthy consequences for me later on in life. And so I'm bringing this up again, in a slightly different terminology, because I would like us to focus on this connection between control and love, which is so important between any two human beings, right? So here's my opening question. It's a big question. And if it doesn't make quite sense to you, Alan and Nicole, feel free to rephrase it. You can do whatever you want with it. I don't know if I have it rightly phrased in my mind, but this is kind of what I would love us to focus on. What are some constructive relations between love and control? And what are some destructive relations, or what is the destructive relation between love and control, especially as it relates to family context?
Good question. I think, going back to the illustration, often children are taught that they are supposed to submit to elders. They're supposed to cooperate, do what they're told by adults. And so they actually can sometimes even feel guilty for doing the right thing by saying no to an adult in a context of abuse. And similarly, within Christianity, many people have been taught, and in other religions as well, many people have been taught that some people are higher than others, that the will of some people should be higher than others. And when we have that in a context of, for example, a marriage, when one person is assumed to be over the other one and superior to the other one, we have paved the way for abuse. All that is left is for the person who assumes entitlement to decide that they want to do something abusive to the other person. So we all, as human beings, have a temptation to control. I mean, this is what Satan said to Eve. He said, "Ye shall be as gods." And Eve went, that sounds good. Basically, Lucifer at the beginning thought that God was keeping the best for himself. That's what he told Eve. Like a mom who's keeping the best chocolates for herself and eating them in the closet. God was keeping the best for himself. And Lucifer said, hey, I'm not going to let him keep the best. So he wanted the power of God without the character of God. And that is the heart of abuse, that we want the power of God without the self-sacrificing relationship to power.
Yeah, I mean, you've had a lot of discussions about love already. And what you discover is that the universe was designed to run on love. That unselfishness was the very principle the universe was founded on. It's the thing that Satan hated. He said it's not possible to be so unselfish. So your question was, how do we relate love and power? And I think you already hinted at the answer, that when you have power, your goal is to try and build up the other person. When you truly love somebody, you do not use your power to lord it over them. Jesus said in Mark 10, that's not what we do. That's what the Gentiles do. Instead, we use our power to serve. So the greater your power, the greater the requirement to serve and to help that person become everything that God wants them to be. So, I cover with my students, what is the role of a pastor? And you don't have many places where the word pastor is used, but it means shepherd in the New Testament. And I share with them that a shepherd is doing what is best for the sheep, and his power is limited to what is best for the sheep. And Jesus said, you know what a shepherd does? He lays down his life for the sheep. So power is simply an opportunity to love people in a way that grows and develops them.
It's interesting. Ellen White says, unselfishness, the principle of God's kingdom, is the principle that Satan hates. And she says its very existence he denies. So Satan says there's no such thing as unselfish love in the universe. And because he doesn't believe God is unselfish, he doesn't see a problem with self-exaltation himself. When the head of a home or the parent of a child or anybody in a condition of more power than someone else thinks that they have the right to exalt themselves, they will inevitably use that power somehow in self-exalting ways. It's only when we believe that the true principle of the kingdom and the character of God is unselfishness that we can become like him and let go of power, use our power to lift others up instead of crushing them down.
And we get so many students who have come out of controlling homes. And let me tell you, it's destructive. That when there's control, you only have two responses. That you either seek to appease the controller or you rebel against it. But neither of these develop self-will. So control is a very negative family dynamic where power is used not to build up the other person, but to bring them into conformity with the controller's desires.
I suppose it's important to mention, because some people are going to go, well, what about parents having authority over their children? This doesn't mean that you don't have authority. It means that the more power you have, the more responsible you are to use that power to lift the other up, to serve, to teach the children, to protect them, not to shove them out into traffic, but protect them from the traffic. And at the same time, to teach them so that they can grow up to where they don't need a parent to control them or keep them away from dangerous things.
And the older they get, the more you give them responsibilities. So what God designed in the freedom of choice is that we would each be able to be responsive. And so he gave us that freedom of choice so we could show responsibility. And my goal with my children is to make them more responsible, not more dependent. Yeah.
Yeah, we want to grow our children to be better than we are, to go higher than we can in serving the Lord and glorifying him.
Yeah. So I don't know if we had answered the question. I mean, we could speak a long time, but we want to make sure we get through all the questions that you have.
Anything else?
That's absolutely beautiful. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that's absolutely beautiful. It's like, I was very blessed to be raised in a home where control was not the main way to show love or to show, like, this is what you must do. But I definitely see what you're talking about, how control can destroy families. Because I can think of a couple of my friends who their families were like, you're going to do this because this is how it's done. And because I have control, this person has control. It's like, you don't really have control. And in the case where, like, this was where it was an elder sibling, then the elder sibling would assert their control as well in non-positive ways. So my question would be, at least for now, it's like, how does someone who may be in this situation recognize the difference between authority and control and change their way of controlling to a way of uplifting?
Good question.
I think a critical question is, what is my desire here? Is my desire to get them to conform? Look, I'll be honest, as a dad, as a pastor dad, yeah, you go into church and your children misbehave, you become hypersensitive to what are other people thinking about my model family. And so then your desire becomes control. I want them to conform so that I look good. Well, that is a misuse of power. What I should be thinking about is, how can I help my kids to be responsible in this situation? And that may mean that I can't solve it right then and there. It may mean when I go home talking with the kids about how can we make our Sabbath experience at church better, so you don't feel like you have to act out like you did today. And so my goal in authority, therefore, is to help the person I am sharing my power with. It is not to get them to conform so that I look good. And I think that's a critical difference.
Ever since the fall, power has been a temptation to self-exaltation. Before Lucifer fell for the lie that God was self-exalting, using his power in selfish ways, before Lucifer fell for that, nobody had ever thought of using power in selfish ways. They saw that biggest, juiciest mango on the tree and they were like, oh my goodness, look at that. I've got to pick that. Who can I give that to? Their great desire was to serve. Now we've turned that upside down, and our law of our kingdom is exactly the opposite of the law of God's kingdom. Jesus showed this when he was continually talking about, guys, the kingdom doesn't work that way. My kingdom is not like the Romans. It's not like what the Jews are picturing, where we want power so we can crush others down and exalt ourselves. Instead, Jesus emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. God always, only, ever uses power in unselfish ways. And that's why he's safe to have at the core of the universe.
So your question is, how would we recognize this in ourselves? And the reality is, you need time to pray to figure out your selfishness. Anger is a form of control. So when I'm getting angry, what I'm really doing is saying, I want my kids to fall in line and I can't seem to get it any other way. So I'm going to lash out at them and cause them pain, because then maybe they will conform to what I desire. So I have to look at my own motives and prayerfully think them through. Why am I getting angry? Why am I insisting on establishing my power? And what is it that might be missing? You know, a kid might just be wanting to have attention, and instead they're getting the wrong attention. And they may feel like, well, wrong attention or bad attention is better than no attention. So I really need to examine myself to figure out what's going on inside my heart.
Right. When some parents who have grown up themselves in abusive situations have vowed, I will never abuse my child, and then they don't even discipline them. And I think they hope that, you know, maybe their kid will love them so much they'll just obey. But the hard reality is that selfish people, generally we stay the same until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. So a child is going to have painful consequences to persuade them to make better choices. The goal of the godly parent is to only cause pain in a way that is going to be what's best for the child, will help the child, not to do whatever is going to keep them quiet so I can have time for myself for a while.
Yeah, so it's actually a selfish thing to say, you do whatever you want to do and leave me alone. And it's not loving. It takes a lot more work to go and deal with the child and say, this is not appropriate. I'm going to have to give you a consequence. You're not going to like this. I'm not going to like this. You're going to complain about it, but I need to set a boundary and a consequence for your growth. And that actually takes more unselfishness than just saying, do whatever you want to do.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Elijah.
I was just, what you said resonated with me, since I come from a pastor's family, and I understand the attention or that whole dynamic that can happen with the child and the church, and to see if it goes one way they're too good or the other way they're too bad. And I can understand that. But stepping away from the notion of control, what are some steps that a parent could use to accurately portray the love and show them how to be a responsible child without even going near the boundary of control?
Yeah, well, one of the things we say is pain is not the enemy, sin is. God uses pain, like when you touch a hot stove, it's designed so that you can take your hand off it so it doesn't burn you. So God has designed pain in our lives so that we can effectively keep away from things that are harmful to us. And so one of the ways in which we help children is to say, I'm going to allow consequences here because I love you, not because I'm trying to control you. It's because I'm teaching you that this will hurt you. And so that's, I think, helping the child to understand pain is not your enemy. Your enemy is the harmful thing, the sin that's going to hurt you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just questioning, wanted to ask a question on what you just said. But what about, so what would you say to things that are on a bigger scale, like with Adelina's example, like how would you deal with a situation that's a little bit bigger than just letting them get in trouble or facing those types of consequences?
You mean beyond natural consequences?
Yes.
Yeah, I think parents need to be directive, and there's a difference between directive or authoritative and authoritarian parenting. And so, if you're going to be directive, if you find out, for instance, that there's an abuse situation, you definitely need to step in and deal with that. If a child is not going to get natural consequences, then you need to supply those consequences. So, no child, many children today feel like, I deserve my phone. It is mine. But the reality is that phone was bought for them. That phone operates on a plan, and you can put consequences around that phone to say, no, that phone is a privilege, not a right. And so I think you can supply consequences, and parents need to be directive that way.
It is loving to supply consequences. God is loving when he sends the flood, when he destroys Pharaoh in the Red Sea. These are acts of love. They're not God blowing up and saying, I've had enough of you guys. He always only ever uses his power in loving ways. So when someone abuses, for example, it is entirely like God to seek to bring justice to that person. That helps the victim, restores their picture of the character of God. It helps the perpetrator of abuse because it invites them in the most compelling way possible to repent.
I've heard of many accounts of parents who have been kind of troubled with themselves when it comes to the way that they parent, and the broken relationships that they start to form with their kids, because they themselves have come from broken homes, broken pasts. They have these cycles that keep on repeating, and though they've said, I don't want to repeat this cycle, I don't want to be the same kind of parent that my parents were before, I don't seem to be able to escape this. And as much as I try, when I get angry or when I feel like I'm losing control, I lash out, and oftentimes they feel like giving up. What word of advice would you give for those parents that feel like, even though they want to have this a method of power with love, or love that fuels power, what word of advice would you give to them if they're wanting to break those cycles, but they feel like they keep on failing, and these relationships with their kids have already been so broken that the kids feel like they can no longer step into a place of trust?
Oh, you are speaking with experience beyond your years. This is true of so many parents. So many parents feel like they are failures because kids will show up your failures, they will test your boundaries, and they will also get grumpy and hormonal. And so dealing with that is challenging. But at the same time, when I'm dealing with kids, why does Amazing Grace only apply to everyone except parents? I am living under God's grace. We do not have a high priest who doesn't understand, but we have a high priest who can sympathize with our every weakness. And he's opened the throne of grace and he says, come to me. And we need to go to him and say, I messed up. And he's like, you know what? I love you. It's not how you performed that counts. It's the fact that I love you that counts. And so I really think we need to experience God's love first, rather than being driven by this, I've got to do it perfectly and I've got to do it right. I've got to be this most loving parent. Even if you were the most loving parent, God was, and Adam and Eve still went astray. This, even in the perfect home, things can go wrong. And so we just need a whole lot more grace than what we've given ourselves.
Yeah, I know God has designed the home and family to reflect to children what his character is like. And that's a heavy task for a parent to bear. There has never yet been a perfect parent.
I thought I was close.
Almost there, but but that means that every parent in some way negatively affects their children's picture of the character of God. And that's tremendously discouraging. When I held my children in my arms the first time, I was just like, oh, I don't want to do anything that's ever going to harm you. I just want to raise you perfectly. And yet I haven't. And that's where I think parents need both to understand that God's grace covers them, and that when they do make a mistake, they need to go to their children and apologize. They need to make things right. And it's when we take refuge in the incredible love of God for us that we're able to actually relax and stop duplicating the patterns of how we grew up. We will continue using power in harmful ways until we behold the love of God and how he uses power. And then we're like, wow, I don't want to be like that. I want to be like him.
Yeah, and it can be really powerful. I remember one time when my son was probably only about 5 or 6 years old, and they were making so much noise, and I was trying to get work done. And so I marched in anger, I'll be honest, to their room, and I threw open the door, and I didn't realize that my son was standing right behind the door, and it whacked him in the face, and he fell down on the ground, and just tears pooling in his eyes. And I went from anger to compassion, just like that. And I sat down with him. I said, I'm so sorry, because I knew I'd been angry. It wasn't like it was just accidental. I tried to claim that for about 30 seconds, and then I knew this was because I was angry that the accident happened. And so I sat down and I said, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have gotten angry. And I apologized. And then he's still crying. And he says, It's okay, Daddy, I forgive you. And there was something so powerful about that, that if we show to our kids that we are trying to do what's best for them, and even if we make mistakes, we can kneel down and apologize. It does something to them and reflects, I think, God's love to them in a different way.
Mm. I love that. And no, I wonder, I've been thinking about these issues recently, maybe just knowing that the topic will come up, but I wonder if also one of the complications here with the question that Kendra raised is that at some level parents kind of want to be the gods, and so it's important for them also to realize that they're not. I mean, their children of course are their own, but they do not possess them in a way that eliminates God out of the picture, right? They need to reflect the image of God and not take the place of God. And I think that puts, obviously there's a lot of pressure on parents to perform, and I think they're harder on themselves than anyone else. But I think it would help them, just like you say, to recognize that to themselves, that they're not God, to acknowledge, their limitations, and even in relationship to the children, because what happens is you grow up as a child. If your parents never acknowledge that, and they act like they should be perfect, which they never will be, and then the child grows up, matures, and starts to notice things, starts to see your limitations, and then there's a sense of betrayal. Like, well, I thought you were supposed to be, this to me, and then I learned on my own that you were not. So I think maybe even for the parents to recognize that to their children, to say, to point them to God and say, we're not perfect, we love you, we do our best, but your best model is God. And so even to point them to that, to train them from early on. I don't know how early they can understand this, but this is a complexity that I've seen in some people, that they put too much pressure on themselves trying to be who they are never meant to be.
And I think there is a difference, as you mentioned, with age of children. Ellen White writes that children have to be taught to obey before they can reason. But if you think of the other side, once they can reason, you have to bring in their reason, because a child who is intrinsically motivated is so superior to a child who is extrinsically motivated.
Mhm.
And I think the way that we do this, you mentioned parents acting like gods, is that we have to stop the power dynamic, the authority dynamic for how we describe parenting, that parents have authority over their children. Instead, I think we have to work with the love dynamic.
Mm.
Parents are to love their children. It is natural, because a parent is a parent, that they have power over their children. It's very natural. But that power must be expressed in love, so that we're not saying, I'm the dad, you have to obey me. That's just how it works. But you say, I'm the dad and I love you. And because I love you, I'm going to use my power responsibly to help direct you, not to control you.
And
Yeah,
we're
and
always tempted to either think of ourselves as more than God says we are or less than God says we are. So we try to exalt ourselves and make our family do what we want. And then when that doesn't work, then we tend to spiral into, fine, I can't do anything. I'll go, I know I need to spend time with God, but I'm going to go clean the kitchen first because it's driving me nuts. And then I'll feel like I'm in control. Well, then my kids come in and, track mud all over the clean kitchen. And then I'm going to blow up at them. Then I feel terribly because I'm like, oh, I'm such an awful mother. So I go from thinking I'm more than God says I am. I don't need to have devotional time. I don't need to go spend time with him first to get my sense of worth. I'm just going to go clean something so that I feel like I've got an accomplishment under my belt. Then I shrink down to I'm less than God says. I'm not even an image bearer. And God wants us to keep our eyes on him, which is the great equalizer. It keeps us from thinking of ourselves as more than what he says, like I can do all this without him, or less than what he says, like I'm such a failure, I'm such a disaster, not even God can do anything with me.
mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question, not on this topic, but it's like I know for a lot of people, they come, like even in the church, they come from halved homes. Like by that I mean either divorce or like in my case, a parent died when they were a child. It's like my mom passed away from cancer when I was 12. And it's like even talking to a random classmate I have, I found out that she had the exact same experience. It's like, what do you say to like spouses dealing with those situations? But like, as we're talking with family, what do you say to the kids who are dealing with that kind of pain, that kind of anguish? Because we were talking about how kids can, like, parents can see themselves as gods, but kids can also see them that way. And so when a parent dies or when a divorce happens, in some ways it can feel like a child is losing their faith in their parents, and that may even correlate to their faith in God. So, what do you say to a spouse or to like a parent who's dealing with, I have lost part of what made this family more whole? And what do you say to a child feels like their faith is crumbling before their eyes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I look, I came from a broken home. My dad remarried, my mom remarried twice. And along the way, when I was 13, my brother committed suicide. So there's trauma. And I think when you've gone through trauma, as many people have, there's some things that you need to process. So, one is you have to grieve. We keep longing for this perfect world that we had, and instead we have to grieve. There's a missing part, and it's gone. And we move through those stages of grief to where we finally accept it. We say, this is what it is, and God can still work in spite of this terrible loss that we've had. And the good news is, in Scripture, it also promises that God will be your husband. God will be your father. Your father. God will be the mother who gathers you like under her wings, like a chicken would gather her little brood. And so when you realize God is the one who's going to step in for that missing role and help to carry you through, it helps you to say, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. You're believing that God is there in the midst of your situation and walking you through it. And I don't know any other way to do it. I certainly know that that's a whole lot more comforting than not having God there.
Yeah, I didn't come from a family of divorce. My parents are still together, but I came from abuse. I suffered abuse by my grandfather, and it was profoundly traumatic to me. And at the moment, and as I was trying to sort through that as a teenager and the overwhelming waves of depression and anxiety and panic attacks and all the things that I had to try to figure out how to navigate, I was often overwhelmed and I felt like God was a million miles away. But as I processed through all of that, I came to realize that there must be someone at the core of the universe who is relationally faithful. It doesn't make sense that the universe is just running on a dog eat dog principle, that whoever, it's just survival of the fittest. It didn't make sense because there's no meaning in a life like that. And going from that understanding, I had to go, well, if there is a loving power at the center of the universe, it must be a relational being. It can't just be a force. Impersonal force can't make relational faithfulness. And going from that, I just had to build in and understand, if there is a God of love and he has all the power in the universe, he must only allow pain because of a loving reason. And now I look back and I see that the abuse that I suffered, the loss that I suffered, did make me into a deeper and richer and better person. Would I want anyone else to go through that? No, I've done everything I can to keep my children from suffering similar abuse. But in the midst of all of that, I learned lessons about the character of God that I wouldn't have learned any other way. And so I think the more we cling to the hand of God in the midst of our suffering, when we can't hold on anymore, he will cling to us. And now I look back and I see that the reason why I've been able to write like this very successful children's series, The Tales of the Exodus, I am writing the things I learned as a child of abuse. If I hadn't been through that, I don't think I would have been able to understand. So I'm writing about how do you have faith in a God of love when he's allowing so much suffering. In the Tales of the Exodus, I'm going through children who are, the children of Joshua and Caleb as they're experiencing slavery, and they're going, why, God, why? So going through the story, I'm giving the principles that have helped me to survive trauma and to see God as a God of love in the midst of that. Ultimately, I have to say, why not me? If suffering is going to happen, why should it only happen to poor kids in Africa whose tribes get mowed down with machetes? Why should it not happen to me, a person who at least has access to the Bible and to knowledge about a God of love? I don't know if that answers your question completely, Ashley. It's a very good question, but I think children in trauma and abuse and painful situations need to know that if you zoom out far enough, it will make sense. We just can't, in the midst of it, be able to. And that's where faith comes in, trusting that a God of love must be allowing suffering for a good reason. Because otherwise, why would he not swoop in with his power to control and make all the wrongs right? And the reason is he's going to make all the wrongs right later in a better way. And ultimately, that's how affliction will not rise up a second time.
I think I see Elijah there with a question.
Yes, I do have a question. So we talked a lot about the relationship, that how we can see God in the family between the parents and children, but I know that's not the only battlefield that happens in the family circle. So what is a way that spouses can keep up their this love of God in their relationships with all these stresses from work and even their kids coming in and maybe breaking that down?
Well, there are a couple of things I would suggest. One is,
I think the main thing is that I submit really well.
you do? So, I think that parents need to get on the same page. The greatest difficulties I would say we've had is when we're not on the same page, and the kids are so smart. They will figure out, if they can manipulate a parent, they will figure out how to do that. They are just expert manipulators.
And we won't tell which one of us is the one that they easily manipulate, but
love, right?
Amen.
So what we've had to do is have those dialogues to say, how do we get on the same page? And secondly, how do we support each other? Because if you're playing power games in a family, triangulation, where you've got somebody has the power and then someone else can manipulate them, and then you've got a three-way thing going on. You need to be on the same page of saying, what is it that we're doing here? What are we hoping to achieve? And that's what's brought us together. And then I have to say, how can I help you in your parenting and your being a mother? And Nicole says, how can I help you in your parenting and being a dad? So those two things have really helped us, and praying together, making sure that our hearts are right before God, has helped us express our power responsibly.
You think of a team of horses harnessed together. That's what marriage is like. You're not running wild and free over the fields and prairies anymore. You have to work responsibly together. And ultimately, when you have children, pull your load together. If one horse is trying to be the one that, drags the other one around, you end up with dissatisfaction on both sides. And so having a parenting saga where mommy says, hey, you just better obey, and if you don't, when daddy gets home, you'll get it, that's so destructive. Mm-hmm. Parents need to be a team. They have to work together. And ultimately, I think the first and best gift that they can give to their children is connection with God, and then connection with each other before the children. When you have that deep relationship with each other and you see each other as equals, it's not one of us has to submit, the other one is going to be in charge, because that just ends up causing so many destructive cycles. We have to be together and, strategize and pray and apologize to each other when one has had to carry the heavier load.
Yeah.
And I think coming back to this aspect of objectification, I don't even think we realize when we do that, really, because as we talked earlier, when you try to diminish someone else's will, you're really treating them like an object, and you don't even know that you're doing that, right? And so when you engage in this power play between two equal adults, right, two equal human beings, that's what you're doing. You're both trying to diminish, or one of them is trying to diminish the other, and that's objectifying them. It's a term that doesn't really get in our head, because we see the person, the physical aspect, and yet we diminish the holistic, the holistic being that they are, with their will and their reason. And so I guess I'm glad you brought that up, Elijah, because I was also looking for maybe trying to get into this transition, talking about spouses, or relationships between two adults. And I feel like a lot of time it's so easy to confuse love with control,
Mhm.
or to incorporate control in a way that you think is from love, right? And so how do you navigate that complex dynamic there of learning what is not love, what is control and not love? What kind of control is appropriate? I guess maybe that's my question. What kind of control is appropriate, if any, between two equal adults?
That's a great question. I'm going to tackle it first theologically and then come back practically. If you've read Tim Keller's The Reason for God, he has a beautiful chapter on the Trinity. And in that chapter, he talks about how each member of the Trinity is sacrificing for the other. They delight to give. He calls it a dance, where each one is just saying, how can I give my glory? Jesus is saying, how can I give my glory to the Father? And the Father is saying, how can I give my glory to Jesus? And the Holy Spirit saying, how can I direct people to Jesus? And Jesus is saying, I'm going to let the Holy Spirit stay behind on my behalf. It's like they can't wait to give of themselves. And practically, what has that meant? We have said, biblically, it has the father as the head of the home. Well, what does that mean? We're two consenting adults. How does one end up being the head? And then it dawned on me as I was studying my theology. That means I have to use the power I naturally have in the sinful world to serve my wife. So my power is to serve. So most of the time, we don't get to do what I want to do as a dad, as a husband. We end up, because I'm constantly saying, how can I serve my family? How can I serve my spouse? And so it actually takes more sacrifice to practice that concept of servant leadership that is involved in headship. Jesus ended up giving his life as the head of the church. And so we don't practically often deal with headship.
No.
What we do is we come together and we find an agreement, and I'm seeking to please Nicole and she's seeking to please me. And mostly because of that, we are able to be in agreement and in harmony.
Yeah, it's not like one of us has to be in charge kind of thing. I think one of the things that people misunderstand when they talk about who's the head of the home is that headship just means the more power you have. Most men are physically stronger. They have more cultural power. They often have more financial power. So that just means that when you have more power, you have greater obligation to serve. This is the way that Christ runs the universe. This is the way that husbands love their wives. So practically, we're going out to eat. My husband's going to say, hey, where do you want to go eat? And I'll be like, no, where do you want to go eat? He'll say, honey, wherever you want is where I want to be. And so that's where we end up, or wherever we have a gift card for.
As long as it doesn't involve cabbage.
Yes, he has his limits. It is.
Sorry, you're a Romanian. You might love cabbage. So,
You'd be surprised.
But we came to a point one time where we were trying to decide whether to build a house. And my husband he looked at the finances. I had thought out, wow, I would just love to build this log cabin, drew up some plans, things like that. And he looked at the finances finally and he said, Nicole, I just don't think we can afford it. Okay. There was no, what? How can you do this to me? He's the one who handles the finances usually. That's why I married him. It's not a control thing. I don't want him. But because I trust that he would never be holding back and saying, I don't want that. He is going to do what he believes is best for me and for the kids. So it's easy for me to submit, if you want to call it that. It doesn't feel like submission. It feels like we made a decision together because I know that he is living in servant leadership and I can trust him. When husbands lord over their families or say, we're going to go where I want to go on vacation because I'm the head of the house, they tempt their wives to discontent. They tempt their children to rebellion. Whereas when we live in servant leadership, we tempt our spouses and our children toward serving in similar ways, because all of us want to serve each other in love. And that's how the home becomes a reflection of heaven. I'd love to say that our 4 teenagers have created a practical heaven on earth in our house. We're not quite there yet, but I do see that dynamic going on when they're very tender toward one another. Today I went out to the garden to start weeding and planting, and my son, who's 15, came out to join me. Maybe he wanted pizza, but maybe not. But he wanted to be with me, and he knew that it would delight me to have him come and join me, even though I know full well he doesn't enjoy gardening.
I think what we're doing here is mutual submission. We are mutually submitting to each other, and therefore there are difficult times. Like, I think when it came to how do we discipline the kids, we had to negotiate that because we came from 2 very different family cultures. But our desire was always, how can we do this together? Not, I'm in charge and you have to obey.
And each of us had to go toward the other's parenting style in order to work together. If you go back to that illustration of the horses pulling a wagon, sometimes you'll come to a Y in the road. One of you thinks we should go this way. One of you thinks we should go that way. And sometimes you have to go one way or the other. And that's where I feel like, my husband's the head of the home. I'm going to trust him in his judgment unless I really feel like he's making a big mistake. But sometimes you just plow a new way that's in between the 2. And that's, I think, the ideal, where each of us looks for ways to serve the other, to flex, to grow. And by doing that, we grow into the image of Christ. Sometimes we image God better by being 2 different people and figuring out how to do things together than by agreeing on everything.
Yeah, I can't think of any situation where I've had to say, look, you just have to do it my way.
No, it just doesn't happen. But if he did, I would say, okay, because I know he would not do that selfishly. He would do it because he loves me. He loves the kids and he's wanting to do the right thing.
Right. So there's definitely that trust, that mutual trust in the relationship that comes through. And I think, when I hear you speak about each other and how you relate to each other, I really see what you were pointing to earlier, Alan, to the Trinity and how they relate to each other by submitting. What does it even mean for God to submit to? Like, God is God, and yet they submit to one another. And I really see the model of Genesis before the fall, where Adam and Eve had equal shared leadership of the earth, and it worked well for a while until it really broke apart. So thank you for that image. I think that's extremely important for us to focus on as Christians, as children, is equal children of God, gifted with different gifts, that we learn to bring each other up, to build each other up, instead of engaging in power plays and tearing each other down. That's
And we can only really image God well in relationship, because God is a relational circle. And Adam, when God created him, named all the animals 2 by 2 and then said, hey, God, where is my other one? In a perfect world with a perfect relationship with God, Adam still sensed, I cannot fully image God until I have another one like myself, not God above me, not the animals below me, but one equal with me who I can serve. And God smiled and said, wow, you've just shown that you have my image in you because you want to serve another equal to yourself. That's the Trinity.
Well, it's 7:58, but I hope we can take a few more minutes. Keegan, I don't know if you had any questions or comments, but if you do, I would welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, so something that really stands out to me between love and control, and you guys really touched on like the practical application of this, and I just want to make mention of it now. I guess for me is understanding like the heart of communication and listening. And like that's like at the heart of submission is learning to listen to the other person, to their needs and whatnot. And you mentioned this a little bit in terms of like practicality of within like the family dynamic between the spouses and kids. Um, but how exactly do we go about learning that skill? Because it's not inherently something that everyone's really good at, right? To begin with, right? It's much easier to put my needs first as opposed to listening to maybe what somebody else needs.
Yeah. And I think of James chapter 4, what causes fights and conflicts among you? And it's your lusts or desires to have. And so I think the first thing you have to do to listen is to kind of put your desires on hold. I want this. I want my kids to be quiet, or I want my house to be clean, or whatever the desire is. You have to kind of put your desire on hold and be present with the other person, because it means eye contact. It means focus. It means listening. I have a love principle, LUV, that really helps me. I listen without saying anything, because I have a tendency to jump in sometimes when I think I know where my kids are going. I'm like, okay, let me solve it for you. Maybe it's a male thing. So listen, then understand, trying to understand and asking some questions so that you can understand what's going on in their heads. Why did you come to that conclusion? And then validate. Validation says, I really want to appreciate your coming to share that with me. That took some guts, and I know you didn't want to share how upset you were, but I'm really glad that you did. And I can see that your feelings have been hurt through this. And I want to let you know that I care about you and I care about your feelings. So listening without speaking, then showing that you understand by asking questions and reflecting back, and then validating that person's feelings. I find that simple principle really helps me to slow down and pay attention.
Yeah, great summary. I think, Satan's way of running his kingdom is it's like a triangle where he puts himself at the top, and anyone who's following his method tries to claw their way to the top by stepping on others. But God's kingdom inverts that triangle and puts the one with the most power at the bottom, using all of their power to lift others up. And in our homes and our families, we often see the clearest revelation of whether we're living by the law of God's kingdom or the law of Satan's kingdom. At work and everywhere else, I can be nice and kind and polite to people because I want to get stuff or don't want to get fired or whatever it is. But at home, when I'm tired and I feel entitled to my free time, my family is going to find out whether I'm really living by the law of the kingdom.
There's maybe one last question that I would really want to bring up, and it's complicated, and I know we will not do it justice because we only have maybe a few minutes left, but people do experience abuse and control. And it's nice to see a couple like you who doesn't struggle with that and can give us a picture of what, how it works as a model. That's very helpful. Because of what I experienced in childhood, my willpower was diminished, and so I ended up in emotionally abusive situations, not physically abusive. That really never happened in adulthood. And I also had, there were sexual boundaries that never allowed for physical abuse of any kind, but my willpower was so diminished that I could not resist emotional abuse. And so in some form or another, it comes back and it haunts you. And there are people who marry and then find out that their spouse is controlling and manipulative and abusive in any kind of way, really. And so I know people like that who are in relationships. I know people like that who are in marriages. I know people like that who have divorced because of that. And my heart goes out to them because I'm free. So I feel like at least I can make a good choice. But what can you tell us about those kind of situations of
Covenant relationship is a serious thing. You can't just leave it because it's an irritating situation, like with your friend. But adultery and murder are two ways to break that covenant relationship. And when people are moving toward those things, it's also a time to take it very seriously. When we are struggling in a relationship that is killing us emotionally or potentially physically, God's image in us cries out to be preserved. So I recommend that people go to counseling. It's complicated. The only real guarantees in abuse situations are, one, it's going to be messy, and two, God will guide us through it as we pray and surrender to him.
Mhm.
But when someone reports to me something that I recognize as emotionally or physically abusive or damaging, I realize that these things cannot just be, swept under the rug. So I recommend to people to get counseling, get help to figure out whether this abuse situation, if it is an abuse situation, can be moved toward repentance.
Mhm.
Matthew 18 has a process to follow, which I think is a fair guide. When your brother trespasses against you, tell him their fault between you and them alone. That's not when you're a child being abused by an adult. That child does not have a responsibility to go confront. That's when when an equal trespasses against you. But when two spouses are going through conflict, and then one of them goes, I just don't think this is working, they can go talk to a pastor or someone else and say, I need some help figuring this out. Maybe some communication and conflict resolution strategies can be very helpful. But in abuse situations, there's an attitude of entitlement. One person believes they have rights over the other person, and that's dangerous. They need other people to confront them and say, no, you don't have rights over this person. The victim cannot successfully confront someone who believes I am over you.
Yeah.
It's a waste of their energy and actually dangerous.
I think we as a church need to stand up against abuse. We have not. This is a failing of our church, and we have broken people all over the place. And look, it comes because we come from situations in childhood, etc., as you mentioned, that caused that. But it is so empowering for a person when somebody stands up for them, when somebody says they can't say no, but I will say no on their behalf. Um, and it's hard because sometimes in the middle of it, a lady who's been abused takes her between 7 or more times of abusive situations before she has the courage to think about leaving seriously. And so she's struggling because she desires to repair this, and because the abuser is often manipulating her emotions to create that sympathy. But where we can provide support structures, and where we as a church can say we will not tolerate this, and we will provide safety for the woman, and we will provide training. Why aren't we talking more about abuse? So I feel strongly, I feel passionately that this is something that we need to do. And I want to just admire you tonight, Adelina, because you have had the courage to talk about your past in a way that is often missing in the Adventist church. And we need to be willing to say, yes, I had this brokenness, and now I want to empower this new generation so that they don't have to face that brokenness that we felt.
Yeah, abuse has to be a massive problem at the end of time, because the love of many is growing cold. And when Satan's lie is all about control, ye shall be as gods, we should expect there will be more and more abusers in the church. And if the church does not figure out how to do something to rescue these people, this is an evangelistic crisis of cataclysmic proportions. Abusers are tying bricks on the feet of drowning victims. And the church and others, we as Christians must rise up and throw a life ring to them, come in there and rescue them in wise and careful ways.
There is an organization in the union, in the Lake Union, called Project Safe Church, which Nicole helped to set up, and where people can report abuse. And so that's a start.
Yeah, and Project Safe Church helps the church to process sexual abuse allegations by church employees or volunteers. We'd like to see things like that being set up all over the church. I would like to see in the next 5 years that the church rises up with, End It Now and other initiatives. I can see that church leaders are starting to realize that control issues can't just be swept under the carpet anymore, because when our families are falling apart, our church is falling apart.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would love to take more time, but I think we need to respect our viewers and your own time. And so I wonder if we could each share like a 30 seconds takeaway just to try to finish in a few minutes here. And then I'll come back to you, Nicole and Alan. Big challenge.
Well, for me, what I had as a takeaway is that God is willing to be your husband and your mother and your father. It's like if you're missing any of those things in your life, whether that be because that person is gone or just away most of the time or just not acting in the way that God would want them to, it's like God's willing to fill that hole.
Mhm.
I really think that point at the end is what I'm going to take away from this, that we need to be more open and supportive of hearing people's stories and sharing them with others, making it something that we can grow together, especially in the terms of abuse and in the family context. And the church family should become a safe space for people to be able to share that with each other. So
My takeaway would be that this picture of God's love in the family unit is one where we are trying to help not only our children grow, but even our partners grow as well. Working with them, not against them, being on the same page, and working together to actually bring up your children in a responsible way. And a big takeaway I had was that, like what you said, was that pain is not something that God does not out of love, but He does it out of love. And as we are trying to show love in our family units, sometimes we have to let our children go through this pain. But that was one of the takeaways that I took from this, and it was really powerful.
Thank you.
I think for myself, we talked a lot about the different issues that come up with families. We evidently see the brokenness that is very much shared, especially in the family unit, and that this brokenness seeps through our humanity. And it sinks in, and we can see it very much when we're in our family unit. But I think it just got me really excited to hope in restoration. When we allow for the love of Christ to compel us to move us forward, especially in the family unit, there's so much place to hope in restoration. And that gives me hope for our church, for generations to come, for our families right now, that no matter where we're at, how broken we can be, that the love of Christ can really cover a multitude of sins and take us to a better place. And we can just rely on that. That's overwhelming grace. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I really appreciate the way, I mean, you've shared with us so many things in this 1 hour conversation. But I think what I really appreciate is seeing you the way we relate to each other. There's nothing more powerful than example, like living examples. And so your words have been extremely helpful to this group and to the viewers, I'm sure. But just seeing them enacted, seeing them being played out in your dynamic, I think has been just beautiful for me. And we need much more of that. And I think the challenge for each one of us is to reflect God's love in any relationship, really, as much as we can, but especially in the family relationship. So I want to thank you for reflecting that, for modeling that for us, because that is extremely important um, for for all of us at any stage of life, really.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We enjoyed our time here.
I maybe just to introduce the next guest for a second. Stacy Hatfield is a assistant professor of anthropology at Andrews University, and she will be joining us on Tuesday. I believe that is March 9. And so, in that conversation, we will continue the topic of God is love, focusing on interpersonal relationships in general, on the community aspect, and how we can reflect God's love in different relationships within the community, the broader community. Nicole and Alan, thank you so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate your presence and your dynamic and your words. We take them to heart, and we will continue to ponder those. And for the last maybe 2-3 minutes, I would invite you to share your heart-to-heart thoughts for our viewers on this topic of God as loving the family.
I hope every person comes away from this remembering this. God always only ever uses his power in loving ways, in self-sacrificing ways. He never exalts himself. I think if our church would really grasp that, we would see a complete shift in our homes, in our families, in our discussions of leadership and headship. Everything would change if we realized the more power you have, the more obligated you are to serve. That's all. Power is responsibility to reflect the character of Christ. Then when people understand that, we stop clawing for positions of power. We stop accusing others of that. And instead we go, wow, I want to become more like Jesus. And it's all right there in the scriptures, in the stories in the gospel, and the kingdom descriptions that Jesus gives, and the desire of ages. And yet we miss it. And I hate to think that the same mistake will plague us that plagued the disciples when they missed what was going on with Jesus' first coming because they were too busy clawing for power.
When I became a new Seventh-day Adventist, as I mentioned, I came from a broken home, and there was a family. They were this was in Africa where I grew up, and they were a family of color who kind of took me in on Sabbath afternoons as I was growing in this faith. And while I did not have in my own home reflected the love that I'd been looking for, I had it reflected through this family. And they showed me how they loved each other and how they brought me in as kind of an extra son, even though I was of a different color. And in Africa, that was a big deal. My Sabbath afternoons became that special place where I could kind of bask in the love that I saw. And I think we have an opportunity, even if they're not, it's not our immediate family, to reach out to those spiritual orphans and to share love with them. And that would be my encouragement, that if you've experienced God's love, then share that with someone else, because maybe you will be that brother, sister, mother, father that they need in their life.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicole and Alan. It was nice getting to know you. Thank you for your wisdom and your spiritual direction that you've offered in this discussion. We really appreciate that. Thank you also, Keegan. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Elijah. And thank you, Kendra. To our viewers, we appreciate the time that you have spent with us. And I can only hope that God will take this and multiply this in ways that he knows that you need it. I wish you a blessed and great weekend, and I hope to see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again.